Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. We are in the dog days of the UCP leadership race. And as is to be expected, things are getting a little bit more spicy as we get a little bit closer to the finish line. One of the things that keeps coming up in the UCP leadership race, though, is Danielle Smith and her Alberta Sovereignty Act. But in the background of that, for progressives and some conservatives, as we're going to see in just a couple of minutes here, there is a fundamental distrust of Danielle Smith, who she presents herself to be, and what the ultimate outcome will be for the province of Alberta if she is elected as UCP leadership, and by measure of that, Premier of Alberta on October 6th. They say politics makes strange bedfellows, and it really is quite telling when two people who are of very different political viewpoints recognize the same problem and get to have a conversation or get together to have a conversation around that. But it's something that we need to be doing a lot more of, because the polarized nature of politics is causing people to overlook things that they probably shouldn't. To join us today to talk a little bit more about that, we're joined by a senior correspondent for the National Telegraph, and I can hear heads exploding in our audience right now, Wyatt Claypool. Wyatt, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thanks for having me on. It's really good to actually, talk to someone who, in a forum where I can actually hash out all the details that I've sort of, or tripping up on myself a little bit here. I guess because I've been talking to people a lot about the UCP leadership race, and you only ever talk to people in bits and pieces. I kind of appreciate having, I guess, like an hour or so to actually break everything out and talk it all over, because so often people want the little sound bites of what's going on. Whose team are you on? Are you pro this person? Are you pro that person? Are you a patriot kind of stuff? And I'm kind of getting annoyed with it. So I appreciate talking to someone who also doesn't agree with me probably on everything. Yet we can probably find common ground on a lot of these issues.
Yeah. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of why are you concerned about Danielle Smith as leader of the UCP and premier of the province, just to get started, who is Wyatt Claypool?
Just some random guy who decided to, at some point, because someone helped me connect me, got into journalism in sort of a mid 2019. And after working at the Post Millennial for a bit and leaving, I then decided to start the National Telegraph with some other people. Things shuffled around when that started up in late 2019, early 2020. And now that it's in 2022, it's mostly me and my sort of correspondent and editor, Danielle Boardman, who run the whole thing. And we tend to do a lot of sort of inside baseball kind of political stories that a lot of people don't like to touch, or sort of like honest commentary, being upfront with the fact that we are conservative, we are partisan, and sort of going from there. Because I always find that it happens both in the legacy media and independent media. Everyone pretends that they're secretly the objective ones and everyone else is a hack. It's like, no, I'm a conservative at the end of the day. I'm gonna give you extremely conservative perspectives, and anyone can take issue with anything I say. I'll try and be factual, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to pretend that I'm like the most trusted name in news kind of a person. Not that I'm like lying or anything. That sounds like I'm lying, but more so that I'm not just telling you this is exactly how it is. There's always opinion baked into what I'll say.
Well, yeah, and I think that there's we did a whole thing on our last episode about how there's a big difference between objective journalism and commentary, and there's a whole spectrum involved there. And there's a difference between cold cut objective journalism, which is as unbiased free as possible, I'll say, and commentary, sometimes satire, sometimes puppets. There's a big difference between those things, and fundamentally, the most important thing that anybody doing any of those things needs to do is to say, "Oh, by the way, this is what I'm doing."
Yeah. Well, here's my point on that, is that even I'm saying that I'll try to be an objective on the facts, but I'm also clearly into the commentary business at the same time. And oftentimes commentary can actually be far more elucidating than just factual reporting. Because especially we'll get into this on the Danielle Smith situation of why I don't particularly like her, is I could just sort of say, here's what she said at this event, and here's what she said at this event, and she's talking about the Sovereignty Act, and she's saying that it's a patriotic piece of legislation that will help us, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, but if I don't put on my conservative hat and talk as a conservative and say, okay, here's what she's promising, here's what she could probably actually deliver, and here's what her path's like. Do I trust her? No, I don't. No, I mean, it's sometimes that which actually is more informative for people than me just sort of like a text document just listing some things that she said.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that seems to be missing. We did a thread on this just today. Is the when it turns into press release journalism, where people are simply republishing what it is that, somebody like Danielle Smith, for example, has said, hey, look, I got this really great endorsement from this organization, and never not once says, oh, and also, by the way, I had the organization on my show, and the president or the founder of the organization is somebody that I know way back when from the Manning Center. Like that little pieces of context, I think that's important.
And the National Telegraph is not in any way a big operation. Some days we'll go 2 days without actually publishing a story. I'm too busy. Daniel's too busy. Some of our other guest writers or people who occasionally give us stuff, they're too busy. We're not trying to just, because there's a little bit of a club that happens in any sort of journalism world, whether it's independent or legacy, where when this person puts something out, I publish every single thing that they say at the debate. I publish every press release, say that they did this, and then you don't publish other people's press releases. I could care less about people's press releases. I publish what I find interesting. At the end of the day, National Telegraph's really just a blog to a certain extent. I'm going to publish what I think. And if people come at me and say, well, you haven't criticized this person yet, I'm like, well, I don't think it's newsworthy, considering the fact that other people are either already criticizing them, or it's not really the big sort of hidden story in this whole leadership race. So, like, I guess if I'm giving background on the leadership race of me, well, you would know him. I was Bill Rock's campaign manager while he was still in the race. I thought had some really good, fresh ideas or whatever, and I would hope that other campaigns would pick them up. But when I got into it, the thing that always bothered me is that I'm looking at Danielle Smith pretending to be the populist conservative when I know she's not a populist conservative. And whenever you call her on her very oddly left-wing position, she's like, well, I'm a libertarian. I'm like, no, you're not. If you actually look into the things that she says and does, like you'd be wondering if it's her saying it or if it's Janice Irwin saying it. It's kind of ridiculous, the sorts of things that she'll say. But my point is, like, that's a story. That's the story that I want to touch on, because I know people aren't going to dig and go down the rabbit hole of how conservative is Danielle Smith really. It's going to get lost in the shuffle, and if someone isn't hounding on it who's interested in it like me, people aren't really going to follow up through it. There's probably no money in it to a certain extent, in terms of a lot of the UCP base doesn't really want to hear too many negative things about certain candidates. And I understand it. If you like a candidate, it sort of pains you to keep hearing people say, hey, they said this, they said that. That doesn't mean that means they're not really that conservative. I'm not going to blame anyone for it, but that's just sort of where I've come into this race, where I want to be honest with where people are on the ideological spectrum. I've even had to go after Brian Jean in the past, but then I'll even write an article saying, well, he did this and it was good. But I'm very consistent, I would say.
So let's get into it then. What is it that Wyatt does not like about Danielle Smith as leader? I'm not saying that it's a personal thing, but as leader for the UCP and as a potential premier for the province of Alberta, what are the things that you bump on?
Yeah, like from the moment she announced, I absolutely didn't want her to become premier, and it wasn't because of some personal vendetta or anything. I've never talked to her in real life on a personal level in any way. I did question her in real life, but I've never spoken to her. I'm not friends with her. I'm not enemies with her or anything like that. I'm simply someone who, as soon as she announced, I'm like, I know her background. I know that she's going to pretend to be this populist, rah, rah, rah kind of a conservative. What I know, she's actually very liberal, especially on social issues. I know that her fiscal policies are very mixed. Like, she's in favor of net zero goals. She doesn't want to achieve them in the same way as Justin Trudeau, but she still buys into the utopian nature of net zero goals, that somehow we can ban the second law of thermodynamics and and be able to somehow have no carbon emissions at all. We can just have perpetual motion machines forever if we pass the right laws. Like, I don't like stuff like that. She's not really hawkish on cutting wasteful spending in government. I would grant you most candidates aren't. That's why I wrote an article saying, hey, Todd Lowen's actually fairly hawkish on cutting spending that's wasteful within the AHS and other sort of institutions like that, rather than doing the Aaron O'Toole nonsense of we're going to grow out of the debt. I'm like, maybe in like 20 years. And then even after that, Danielle Smith in my opinion, using the Sovereignty Act because she's not that great on fiscal issues and she's terrible on social issues in order to muscle her way through this leadership race. And even that's kind of falling apart because I think she has about 2 or 3 different positions on her own Sovereignty Act at this point. There's nothing consistent about it yet. If you ask the average person who's supporting Danielle Smith right now, they've been giving the impression by her that the Sovereignty Act is this very solid thing that day one she can pass and it's going to solve all of our problems. And I think that's deeply damaging for politics for many reasons. Not only because I think that it's going to disillusion people and it doesn't come true, but it's also I don't like when people sort of use rhetoric to get into office rather than actual solid policy.
Now, you've also, in our little pre-interview, you talked a little bit about some historical things with Danielle Smith that you have some concerns with as well.
Yeah, and that's what I meant when she first announced. I wasn't just going to make a bet that she was going to say liberal things in the race. I was thinking like, okay, I know she was the Wild Rose leader, and the Wild Rose leader the Wild Rose Party, in theory, is to the right of the PCs back in the day. But I always remembered that she was very, very socially liberal, and like she'll say libertarian, but again, I would characterize this as just being socially leftist when she says certain things like that there needs to be like I don't know the exact quote, but after she lost the 2012 election and someone made that kind of extremely rude like a fire comment during that election, she then went to a gay pride parade and then said to it that, oh, I'm having conversations with people about where free speech and religious freedom start and where they bump up against equality rights. I'm like, well, that's not a very libertarian thing to say. There's the implication there that somehow we need to curb free speech or religious freedoms in favor of like collectivist freedoms, which are kind of strange. And then in 2012, she said that Hillary Clinton would have been a fantastic president. And I know people will be like, well, that was 10 years ago. I'm like, well, I want a leader who's arrived and isn't just constantly on a political journey taking positions that they abandon all the time. And you're the Wild Rose leader in 2012. What do you like about Hillary Clinton? I don't think that she was as bad back then in certain terms of a lot, like Benghazi hadn't happened, a few other things that would have been sort of corrupt dealings that the Clintons had done hadn't happened yet. But Hillary Clinton was a very high spending, high regulation Democrat when she was in the Senate. I'm not sure what she's looking up to, but in a podcast she was on, she was like, well, she has the experience to be president. And one of the pieces of experience she said is she was the first lady for 8 years. Like, I don't care what the first lady can be president. Like the first lady experience makes you president. Like, I know she was the senator up to that point because she's the senator for New York up to 2009. But again, there's nothing a Wild Rose member, MLA, or leader should really value in what Hillary Clinton did when she was in the Senate. And then you fast forward to 2014. I might be missing a couple of things, but there's just so much I can go through. But in 2014, despite the fact that she's like, oh, I'm going to make sure my government has no involvement with the WEF and whatnot, she's mad at Alison Redford for resigning and causing a WEF event in Alberta to get postponed, saying that it was highly embarrassing, and then saying that, well, I still hope it goes forward and whatnot. And it's like, well, can you at least explain why you used to think that? But like Danielle Smith in 2022 pretends as if everything that happened previously before 2022 didn't happen. But even in 2022, she's still endorsing the idea that men should be allowed to compete in some women's sports. She's endorsing the idea of net zero, like emissions goals and whatnot. She's there's another thing she said. I'm forgetting it now. But yeah, like there's a lot of things that she's kept carrying forward on her campaign. She has a liberal and NDP candidate on her campaign as a deputy campaign manager, Mike Butler, who ran for the NDP twice in 2008, who ran for the Liberals in the provincial and federal level 2011, 2012. It doesn't really signal to me that she's the conservative she's trying to sell herself as, and that's the concern I'm taking. And yeah, pointing this out doesn't make me a lot of friends.
Well, I mean, I feel like I have to say, as you mentioned earlier, there are definitely some things that you and I are going to disagree on because what I take away from what you just said, and if I'm putting this in the wrong context, please correct me, because I have some complicated thoughts in regards to the participation of trans people in sports. I think that it's been oversimplified in a lot of ways. But your concern is more that she has been inconsistent with her positions. Is that correct?
She's inconsistent in some of her positions. Some of her positions she pretends she does not have in this leadership race. Again, if you look at this leadership race, she's the tough Alberta patriot who's going to bring free market values and respect everyone's values as the premier, when she just doesn't have that history. Or she's flip flopped on a couple of different things. Like she's flip flopped on the provincial sales tax. And again, she'll attack people saying, well, at the time, I felt like it was needed. Like our economic situation has not improved that much since then. We're still in heavy amounts of debt. Based on what she said previously, there is absolute justification in her mind for provincial sales tax. I don't back it, but I don't know what's changed so significantly that 2 years ago we needed it, but we don't need it now. The same thing with other positions she has where she's libertarian and she's going to fight the federal government. Yet she says CBDCs are inevitable and they're going to happen and we got to get used to it, kind of stuff. And then when I say CBDCs, it's central bank digital currencies. It'd be turning, it'd be kind of like collectivizing sort of your bank account system with the central bank or whatever. It's a very silly idea. There's a lot of problems with it. Yet, even though she wrote an article opposing it, and she even cited the National Telegraph in that article. She cites an article in the article. She sort of opposes it in theory, but then just says, "Well, it's inevitable, and the World Economic Forum's pushing for it, so it's probably going to be a thing someday." Well, like that's not exactly the tough Alberta patriot stance that I would assume you would have taken. I thought you would have used your bully pulpit to go after the federal government for pushing that, rather than saying, "Well, Pierre Poilievre's too late because Justin Trudeau is going to be the prime minister until 2025."
I mean, obviously, the next question is there anyone that you do like for the UCP leadership race?
I don't know. If I was filling out a ballot right now, it would be something like Todd Lowen maybe first, and then it would be a bit of a car crash for second place between several candidates. When I say several candidates, probably be between Taves, Jean, and Schultz. It's really just sort of there's not someone has to prove themselves still in my mind a little bit back there, and I'll give Todd my first vote because at least I think he's been good on a few issues consistently.
He's certainly been consistent.
Yeah, and I think and consistency is a big leadership quality. That's where this is where in the 2020 Conservative leadership election, I marked Peter MacKay before I marked Aaron O'Toole. Aaron O'Toole was number 4 on my ballot. Peter MacKay was number 3. Even though Aaron O'Toole tried to make himself the true blue conservative, I knew he was very liberal. And the National Telegraph was the first publication to be consistently saying he's a Trojan horse. He is an extremely liberal person. He's going to flip-flop in every promise he makes in this leadership race. So that's why I put Peter MacKay third, because at least Peter MacKay is honest about the fact that he's Peter MacKay. Whereas the problem with Danielle Smith is that she's kind of the Aaron O'Toole of this race in my mind, that she's pretending that she's the most conservative person in the race, maybe slightly behind Todd Lowen, when there's nothing in her record that would suggest that she's this conservative battle axe.
Okay. So is your concern with Smith more that she has been so inconsistent and mercurial in regards to her positions?
I would put it that I would say, yeah, that outweighs the positions she took a little bit more. The inconsistencies, it's sort of like the cover up is worse than the crime kind of a thing. It's sort of like the inconsistencies kind of worse than the positions you took, because she basically has a lot of the same social positions as Leela Aheer. But at least Leela Aheer is Leela Aheer. She's honest about who she is, and I'm not going to probably vote for her and near the top of my ballot in any way. But I can at least give her credit that she's consistent on being a very liberal conservative. But when Danielle Smith is a very liberal conservative, but then pretends not to be, that makes it so much worse.
Okay. Now let's talk about some of those inconsistencies, because there's one piece in particular that just doesn't want to seem to go away when it comes to Smith's campaign. And this is, I'm getting into the GoFundMe now. So for anybody who's not familiar, Danielle Smith started up a GoFundMe a better part of a year ago, where she put the GoFundMe up and she was advocating for, I'm still not sure what. It was like a legal...
It was a legal case to essentially not, and this is where I thought the whole thing was kind of strange. Not that it's fraudulent or something like that. It's just more so it was a strange legal strategy where she's like, it's not that the J&J, this new J&J vaccine were not available. It's that they weren't available enough, or that early treatment wasn't available enough. And that might be a good thing to go after the government for, that you should be making these things more available. Fair enough. But it was like you're suing the government to provide more of a resource. Like that seems like a strange legal strategy. And even in her GoFundMe, which you've read all the updates for, I assume, she even mentioned that her lawyer admitted that this probably requires more of a political solution than a legal remedy. I'm like, huh, I wonder who has a massive political platform who could solve this issue without raising any money. It might be Danielle Smith, but I'm not sure. But yeah. So sorry, I won't cut you off, but you can I guess detail out more what was going on with the GoFundMe. But it was essentially saying we want more early treatment options and we want more of this new J&J vaccine made available.
Yeah. And it's important to notice that when this was initially posted, this was similarly, I mean, we're talking almost a year and a half ago. This was initially put up around the same time that Danielle Smith was, through her own platforms, advocating for treatment options that were without any evidence whatsoever. And part of the lawsuit was to make early outpatient treatment options available for those who develop COVID-19 symptoms, which is in and of itself, it sounds like it's a bit of a Trojan horse to have the conversation about ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine.
And even I personally am one of those people where I'm like, yeah, just let people do the treatment options they want. Because at the end of the day, if you don't have a solid, this is the 100% effective, let it happen. Because those people aren't going to take the ones that you recommend anyways. But it doesn't matter.
I would.
That's where we disagree. See, people are seeing the contrast between us.
I would argue that that healthcare professionals have something of an obligation to practice evidence-based medicine, but I have a huge bias on that one. But without going down that rabbit hole, so she said that it was primarily to get the early treatment and more access to the Johnson & Johnson. Now she raised $425,000 of a $100,000 goal, and if I'm correct, the way that she justified that $100,000 goal is that she wanted to identify physicians who would say, hey, yeah, there's these other treatment options and I'd be willing to prescribe them because there are good and bad doctors out there. But that lawsuit never proceeded.
Yeah. Well, they couldn't find a doctor, apparently. I guess they said they found some plaintiffs that they could use, because this wasn't like a lawsuit where Danielle Smith was going to be the plaintiff. It was the whole point is that we're going to raise money so we have a war chest to back a plaintiff in a case, which is fair enough that a lot of people do that. And it's like charity law. It's kind of like a charity lawsuit kind of a thing. I'm not sure if I'm putting that right. That's all. Yeah. That's all fine. That's all on the up and up. But they found the plaintiff. They couldn't find the doctor. So they kind of folded and they said, okay, well, we can't do this. So we paid a retainer to WK lawyers. It was like $30,000. I'm not sure how much of that they would have spent, or if it was all spent. It was $30,000 retainer was sent to them, and then they would have had something like $70,000 or $71,000 left, or whatever. Maybe some of it was spent on press releases. You never know, but there's money left over. That's substantial.
Okay, so now I'm going to go through this step by step because again, I think that there's some important pieces that are involved in this. The lawyers that she paid the retainer to. Are you aware of any connections between her and those lawyers?
Yes.
So I'm really bearing the lead on that one. But that law group is the same group that wrote the Free Alberta Strategy, that allegedly wrote or maybe didn't write, we don't really know yet, the Alberta Sovereignty Act. It seems to depend on what day you ask, how it's going to work and what the mechanisms are.
Well, it doesn't even matter because the Sovereignty Act is warped so many times. Whoever originally wrote it has like no involvement at this point.
Exactly. But the people who came up with the idea, that was the law firm. One of the lawyers involved in that law firm is an ex-Wild Rose MLA and was also one of the, please correct me if I'm mistaken, one of the lawyers who floor crossed with Danielle Smith back in the Wild Rose floor crossing days. How am I doing so far?
The only thing that you didn't mention was that he's a double floor crosser, but yeah.
Fair enough.
PCs to Wild Rose to PCs.
There we go. So that's the law firm that was provided this $30,000 retainer. Now the $30,000 retainer number that comes from Danielle Smith herself, because she was asked about this on Ryan Jesperson, and she identified that the $30,000 retainer had been provided to the lawyers. How am I doing?
Yeah, she did. Yeah.
Okay.
I watched those clips last night just to make sure I had that straight.
It's almost as if somebody running for the premier is like really, really good at gaslighting or something. So what happened with the lawsuit?
Yeah, so like we were saying before, they didn't find the doctor, so the lawsuit didn't go forward. She was honest with that. So the lawsuit's not happening. We raised all this money. Certain people even donated like $10,000, $5,000, $2,000. Like there wasn't actually even that many people who donated to this. It was only in the hundreds of people. So a lot of people actually donated a lot of money to this, and I would assume would be very invested in the money being used properly. And it might have been used properly. I just don't know. I don't have enough information. But she then said on both Ryan Jesperson's show, and you can again correct me if I'm wrong, as well as on the text of her own GoFundMe update, and it was the last update that I believe happened in July of this year, where she said, well, I have the big bulk of money left from the case. I would say that it's fair to say the majority of the money that's still left over, just based on what she said was in a retainer. And then what we don't know was spent with the other amount of it. I'm just going to assume it's probably the majority. Maybe it's not. But she was saying that, okay, I'm going to be donating this, or at least giving some over, a substantial amount, some question mark number of the money over in a way that's at least worth mentioning that I'm sending it over to the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, or what more people just tend to refer them as the JCCF, which is a charity legal organization where you donate money to them and then they pursue constitutional cases on people's behalf. Well, not on people's behalf, but they'll pick up people's cases against the government and pursue them. So she was going to give money over to the JCCF for the Brian Peckford case against the travel mandates, I believe, or it's another Brian Peckford case. I assume it's the travel mandate one. I think that's his only case, but that's her story of what was going to happen with the funds that she had not used.
Okay. So my understanding, he said cautiously, is that Smith was asked on Jesperson, and I may edit in the clip here just so that people can see the actual answer for themselves.
People want to know where the rest of the money went.
Yeah, so I've just been talking with the lawyers, because part of the issue we face, we did do a number of interviews with a number of doctors to see if some of them would come forward and take on the challenge. And unfortunately, they're terrified of the government, frankly. They're afraid that the government is, that the College of Physicians and Surgeons, once they get a black mark on their file, that they're going to not be able to do their work in the rest anywhere in the world. So I've been in touch with the JCCF, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom. They've got two ongoing pieces of litigation, and so we're just going to piggyback on that. Where the one of them is to protect the rights of doctors to have the right to treat and the right to offer medical exemptions. So we're just going to piggyback on some of the lawsuits that are already going on rather than have our own separate one.
Did any of the funds raised from that crowdfunding effort go toward funding your leadership campaign?
I was going through WKA lawyers. I mean, no. And so, yes, $30,000 went to WKA lawyers.
Okay. So $30,000 from the crowdfunding went to fund your leadership campaign. No, that's what I'm asking. It's a question.
No. $30,000 went to WKA lawyers, because we were doing, as I mentioned, the pre-work of just trying to vet the different doctors to try to find a candidate who would be able to help us. And then we ultimately are going to be working with JCCF to support their effort.
Okay, so to be clear, no funds raised from that crowdfunding effort are involved in the $175,000, whatever it is that you just ponied up and paid the other day. You know, I have to ask, right? People want me to ask the question.
She was very clear. No. There was $30,000 that was put in a retainer account. That's the money that went to the lawyers. The $30,000 in the retainer account. And when she had the she didn't have any updates on her GoFundMe from November of 2021 up until the day of or the day after the Ryan Jesperson interview, where she put up what I think you're referring to, where she talked about she asked one of the lawyers from the law firm. Oh, did we mention? I'm not sure. One of the lawyers is also the chair of her leadership race.
Yeah.
Did we mention that yet?
Yeah. Is he one of their lawyers, or is he more so associated with the law firm?
He's listed as a partner on their website.
Oh, okay, so fair enough. We're fact checking ourselves as we go,
which is a good thing to do, I think.
Yeah,
but
we're being overly cautious here for the person who is very invested in how cautious we're being. We're being very cautious here.
Rob Anderson, who is one of the lawyers with the firm, he's also her co-chair, or her chair on her campaign, I should say. So what Smith said in her final update on her GoFundMe was that she asked one of the lawyers to find a way to donate her crowdsourced funds that sat unspent in the retainer account.
Yeah.
So it sounds like we're talking about the $30,000 in the retainer account that she identified on Jesperson like 24 hours less than beforehand.
Plus other unspent funds potentially, because she was more so in that case just responding to Jesperson asking about the $30,000.
Oh, no. I'm talking about the GoFundMe update.
Oh, okay. So never mind. Okay.
Yeah. So on the GoFundMe update.
Sorry, I thought. Are you reading it?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I thought you were just talking about it. Never mind. Okay.
No. I'm reading it word for word for a very specific reason. So what she says is, I asked Mr. Frome to find a way to donate my crowdsourced funds that sat unspent in the retainer account to other legal actions on similar issues. Mr. Frome suggested that the retainer funds go to the JCCF, in particular Brian Peckford's case and the Alberta doctor's case. You can read more about these exciting cases on JCCF's website. Now,
there's some stuff going on there, because what that seems to say is, A, she doesn't actually say that the money was given in that update. There's no explicit, and then we gave the money. What she says is Mr. Frome suggested that the retainer funds go to the JCCF, in particular, Rana. So there's no like, I gave the money, here's the receipt. But the other thing that she says in that update is that she's very clear it was the retainer account, and it's the retainer account that she identified on Jesperson that had $30,000 in it. So that begs the question, not begs the question, I always get that wrong. That forces the question, what about the other $71,000?
Yeah, so the thing is that and this might have been one thing I got wrong when I ended up giving them an email just to check in, but I was wondering if there was at least someone could verify it that the money had been sent so far. So I ended up emailing the JCCF, and I think I accidentally said, did she send over $70,000 to you guys? Maybe use a retainer account. At the same time, I would expect that the donors would want all the money sent somewhere rather than just sitting in a bank account somewhere. So the retainer funds or whatever other money, doesn't really matter, that she said in this interview that she sent you guys money or some substantial amount of money or whatever. And the first thing that they sent back to me was just asking, can you give us the link to that? Or can you give me the link to that? And this was the head of the JCCF's communications. And it's like, I'm being very clear. I'm not saying that they did not get money from her in any way, but it was just odd to me that they didn't immediately say, well, because they later followed up and gave me some sort of corporate stuff of saying, we can't tell you who donated to us in any way, shape, or form or whatever. And that's fair enough, whatever, that's what you can do. But when you first come at me and ask me, where's the link to that? It seems a bit odd that you are unaware of her having committed to giving money over. Maybe they contend that, oh, well, the retainer fund was sent to us. It was just not the 70,000 that you were referring to. But still, I would at least like there to be some transparency in terms of just here's the money that was donated, because then I'm like, okay, fair enough. Great. The leader gave over the $70,000. That's actually applause worthy in a lot of ways, that here's the money that they gave to this charitable case to fight vaccine discrimination.
Okay. Now, a couple other things that I just want to chase down before we move on to the next chunk of things. It has not been that people haven't asked Miss Smith to say, hey, what'd you do with the money? There's been people asking, what'd you do with the money?
And I know that
you.
Well, I was just going to say, here at the breakdown, we asked her in a politely worded tweet, hey, would you be willing to provide a full accounting for the GoFundMe funds that you raised? And she gave us a very quick response, which was blocking us on all social media.
I'm blocked too, so welcome to the club.
I think most of Alberta, especially on Twitter, I think most of Alberta is blocked by Smith. If it isn't a fawning sort of, you're the bestest ever.
It's a running gun battle on to see who can block more people first, whether it's Danielle Smith or Michelle Rempel.
There you go. So there has been no shortage of opportunity for Danielle Smith to say, hey, you know what? Here's the receipts, y'all. But instead, she has chosen to say effectively nothing. But you've done some other inquiries. So what are the other inquiries that you've done into this through the National Telegraph?
Well, yeah, well, I was just sort of calling people around or messaging around, because that's usually what you have to do as some muckraking journalist like myself, is you have to go sort of prod around and see if anyone will talk to you. So that was the first thing when I inquired with the JCCF, seeing if they were familiar with him giving over money. Fair enough, they're not allowed to tell me. I'll leave it at that. But I had then messaged someone senior on her campaign about the money that was given over, who would be very familiar with the retainer and the funds that were being collected by the GoFundMe and whether or not they were used, because they would know Danielle Smith very personally, and then they would also be generally familiar with the way that the legal case went. And what they told me was that essentially, like, well, no, we have no right to tell you what we did with it, but we're going to tell you that we did it. But the only way you're ever going to find out is if someone has to be sued in court to have us produce the receipt or something like that. Like, to produce evidence, someone would need to be sued in order to get that information, which I took a little bit of umbrage with personally. And I guess they don't want to, for any ethical reasons, say, here's my receipt that I'm going to present that I gave money to the JCCF or something like that. So I found that a little bit odd.
Okay.
Just the behavior.
Let's be very clear here. Neither of us, certainly not me, are saying that Danielle Smith didn't give the money. Nobody's making that claim for any lawyers who are maybe listening to this and making notes or anything like that. Nobody's saying that Danielle Smith didn't give the JCCF the money. The questions are, how much money did she give the JCCF? How were the rest of the funds for the GoFundMe used? And why doesn't she want to talk about it?
Well, yeah, and again, why we're both saying literally nothing about whether she did it or not. And it's more so that you said you're sending it. You could even have said, hey, I haven't sent it yet. It's going to be sent in a couple months, blah, blah, blah. Fair enough. That's an answer. And what was funny is when I got that kind of oddly obtuse message back from someone on her campaign, they then said that it was like, we sent the money and we're keeping the retainer fee, or that the retainer fee is being kept, which was a contradiction. Maybe they just slipped up, I don't know, but it made it sound like either they're not on the same page, or they're saying that it's actually the retainer fee that's not being given over to the JCCF, but it's the other money on the GoFundMe that's being given over. So I'm confused with what's happening now based on people who should be familiar or could easily ask on what's going on. Especially because they spoke with a lot of authority on it.
I just want to make sure that I'm getting this right. Danielle Smith said that the retainer account was being donated to the JCCF.
Another person who
her
is
lawyer from said it.
What's that?
Because she even if we go back to the exact quote,
right. It was her lawyer friend said it would be a good idea to donate the retainer account.
Yeah.
Didn't actually say whether or not it had been happened. So fair point. I take the correction on that. So Danielle Smith, in her update on the GoFundMe, said, one of my lawyers said that it would be a good idea to donate the retainer account. That was the last update that she provided on the GoFundMe. She's never provided any sort of documentation for how that $100,000 was spent. She identified that the retainer account had $30,000 on Jesperson, but you heard back from somebody who's extremely close to the situation, and they said, we're keeping the retainer account, we're keeping funds in a retainer account, and other money went to the JCCF.
Maybe it'd be smart of me just to quickly double check the exact verbiage of it here. Not that I want to drag this out, nor it's just going to become just me reading me reading messages on my computer. But still, it said the what do you see?
If it helps, I have it here in front of me because you said
maybe you can and read
sure.
the most vague way possible.
I'll read the pertinent section here. No funds whatsoever were used improperly. They were only used in the pursuit of the contemplated lawsuit and when she couldn't find a doctor willing to risk a career to sue. A large portion went to the JCCF, as she has described, with a smaller amount retained in trust to be directed to related lawsuits when the need arises and Danielle directs. So at the very least,
it sounds like to me, and again, this is my characterization of the way that that's worded. It sounds like something, let's just say along the lines of anything up to 40%, anything from 0 to 40% was retained because that's the minority of the money. And I'm saying any money that wasn't already spent, and then 60 to maybe 90% of it, depending on what the ratio is here, was given over to the JCCF. But at the same time, the proportions are still being kept very vague, and I think that's on purpose.
So let's purely speculate for just a sec here, because one of the things that I have not been able to wrap my head around with this thing since day one has simply been, if Danielle Smith spent some money on legal stuffs and then donated a bunch to the JCCF and then apparently kept some in a war chest legal fund for a rainy day or whatever, by the way,
it's her right to do.
Sure, it's her money. I think there's a question that probably should be asked for the people who donated to it. Hey, so you intended for this money to be used for this thing, and then it absolutely wasn't, but she's keeping some for a rainy day. That's cool with you, right? I think that there's some ethical questions to be asked. And I think it's really important to highlight that we're not talking about somebody who GoFunded me their utility bills or their car repair or their medical treatments. We're not talking about Joe Citizen or Jane Citizen. We're talking about somebody who's trying to run for the highest office in Alberta and using funds that were intended for one thing for a bunch of other things by their own admission.
Yeah, and I know that she has no obligation if somehow she hits a wall with a lawsuit to just start giving any money that wasn't spent back to people in a proportional amount. At the same time, you see it and it's like, okay, well, I'd at least like, especially again, because you're running to be premier, as much transparency on what happened here as possible. It's just like and the thing is, I think the same questions apply to people like Travis Taves when it's like, okay, well, what was said on the COVID board? Can we get people to testify to what your contribution was? Were you pushing for harsh lockdowns, blah, blah, blah? People can make the same inquiries about Brian Jean, like, oh, well, how was your his record as a Wild Rose leader? Did you use money properly? And you should be allowed to inquire about any of this, because the whole point is that when you're trying to be, again, the premier of Alberta, everyone does have a little bit of the right to ask for you to sort of substantiate a lot of the promises that you've made or a lot of the commitments you've made in the past. And here's another thing on the JCCF thing. And I've been told this a couple of times by a few different people over the past day or so, where they were saying, well, that actually does rub me as odd, if that there's not just her saying, here's the check, Wyatt Claypool's a idiot who's like inquiring about things he shouldn't be or whatever, and he's trying to claim I'm a liar. I'm not in any way. I'm just asking about what was done. But a lot of people were saying, well, it was odd. This sort of struck them as odd as well, because she didn't show up to the JCCF event at Gasoline Alley in Heritage Park in Calgary. Like, what you'd think that you donated a substantial portion of your GoFundMe money to them. Maxime Bernier was there, Drew Barnes was there. They were getting rounds of applause every time that they were being mentioned by the JCCF hosts and whatnot. You think you're running for office, you'd show up to this big event where you'd probably get a lot of campaign donors there. Yet there seems to be this distance from the JCCF at a time when you think that it would be like a great opportunity to go to an event and like be able to promote yourself. Maybe she had other commitments, fair enough. But at the same time, there's just a lot of little micro anecdotes here that make me want to know more, like make me want to verify this question around the GoFundMe money more.
Well, and this is where the speculation part comes in, because what I was trying to work my way towards and then got distracted on the minutia was it would seem to me that it would be a lot easier for Smith to say, hey, I spent $20,000 on the lawsuit. I donated 70 to the JCCF. I'm pulling the numbers out of the ether for the record here. I donated 70 to the JCCF, and then I kept $10,000 in a retainer account just in case there's another pandemic or something. That would put the whole thing to bed. But we're now running into month 3 of her saying nothing, and high-level people affiliated with her campaign saying the only way we're ever going to give that information is if somebody sues someone.
Like, so private from my cold dead hands. No one said that. No one said that, lawyers. Don't worry. But anyways, but yeah, no, you think that you, in my mind, and this is just purely my perspective, if I made a donation to someone, I'm not saying if someone doesn't do this, then they're lying or something. I'm not saying this at all, but I'm just saying from my perspective, if I was running for premier, I would be publicizing my donations to pro-freedom organizations like the JCCF. I'd be like, yes, absolutely, I stand up for freedom. And when my lawsuit seemed to hit a barrier where we couldn't go forward, I made sure that it was going to go to good work, fighting the travel mandates and other sort of restrictions and bans and whatnot. Like, that would have been I think that would have been a good solid line to put down in an email to all the members, but it didn't happen, which is, again, not evidence of anything bad as much as just an oddly missed opportunity in my mind.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's really important to highlight that there is, as you said earlier, there's no legal obligation for Danielle Smith to provide any sort of documentation in regards to how this $100,000 was spent. But that kind of gets to, and this is where I bump on it in particular, the crux of the question then becomes, does Danielle Smith believe that as premier, she should be held to a higher standard than somebody crowdfunding their utility bill or not? And it seems like, given the resounding silence and the response that you got where they said, only in court, it seems like the answer is no. As premier, she should not be held to a higher standard. What do you make of that?
Well, and this is the thing that I've heard from so many people who used to be MLAs within the Wild Rose Party or were members or were kind of higher up organizers, is that Danielle Smith is a princess and she demands to be treated like one, in the sense that she'll push off all the work onto other people. They'll do all the policy stuff. They'll do all the organizing. And she should be given free reign to say what she wants and do what she wants without contradiction, which is why when she was the Wild Rose leader, and you're in opposition where you should be making sure that party unity is like your main job when you're in the opposition. And she's kicking people out of the Wild Rose Party while she's the leader because they don't like the fact that she's pushing the Wild Rose Party in a left-wing direction in terms of social issues and then softening them when it comes to fiscal policies and whatnot. So she starts kicking people out, going towards her floor crossing later on in 2014. It doesn't really strike me as someone who's going to be a good person when they become premier or good at the job, because they don't really have that humility to say people are allowed to criticize me because, hey, I'm the biggest target. I should be expecting to take a lot of flack. But she doesn't seem to be willing to take a lot of flack. And I think this sort of leads us into another issue here. And it's the presence of Liberal and NDP organizers on her campaign. There's this guy, Mike Butler, who's on her campaign. And I don't take issue with people getting campaign jobs from all sorts of different politicians. But in my mind, as the person who's marketing herself as a populist conservative who is really tough on Justin Trudeau and whatnot, it's weird when you're hiring someone who has so much in-depth experience with organizing only for left-wing parties that she would want Mike Butler on her campaign. I have nothing against Mike Butler. He seems to be a decent organizer. But at the same time, I remember when I asked her at a Pierre Poilievre event while she was walking out about Mike Butler's presence, she almost pretended as if she didn't know who he was. Maybe we'll play that clip in the thing because it's fairly short. Or at very least, she just says, oh, go talk to Matthew Alpine. He handles all the hiring. And it's like, well, Mike Butler is like your deputy campaign manager for Alberta North, and you're not going to, talk to me about him at all or say, no, I don't really care if he has a Liberal background. He's great at what he does. Like, she just dodged it. And then after me, Ambrose Ralph, we incidentally were reporting on the same thing. I remember I actually texted him. I'm like, I didn't realize that you were covering that because we both released our initial videos / articles on Mike Butler within 30 minutes of each other. That when we did that, she accused me and Ambrose Ralph indirectly of harassment and doxing of her campaign, of one of her deputy campaign managers, or harassing her campaign staff. And I thought that was very telling of her leadership style, is that when you start researching something, that's when she's going to start accusing you of things. And she accused us of engaging in cancel culture at the same time that she was basically insinuating that we're dirty smear merchants or something like that.
Again, I go back to the idea that there seems to be more than one Danielle Smith. There seems to be this, what you've referred to as a populist conservative persona. There seems to be a Danielle Smith that has some ease in saying sound clips that are going to get her a lot of attention and a lot of free media. But for somebody who says that she has been fighting against disinformation and has been fighting against the abuse of authority and all of that, as soon as she's challenged, she seems to get very unhappy.
Yeah, and like, but yeah, like you're right about she has very many different faces, and I think you would even highlight a couple others. So there's libertarian Danielle Smith, who stands up for people's rights to make their own choices and whatnot. Then there's socially progressive Danielle Smith, who's talking about how maybe free speech rights and religious freedoms need to have limits in opposed to equality rights and stuff like that, and her talking about the biological men's participation in women's sports and whatnot. And then I think you told me about this actually a day or so ago when I was just kind of chatting with you a little bit on this issue, is that you even mentioned that like she's a little bit of a Green Party person, depending on the day, when she starts talking about kind of granola type holistic what's the exact term, but she's like that kind of, depending on the day, she's pro cigarettes, and then she's anti-cancer treatments or whatever. It's very odd, or whatever she exactly said. Basically, she was talking about like, well, it wasn't homeopathy, it was something else.
It was naturopathy. I mean, she did a whole bit where she said that everything up to stage 4 cancer is a person's responsibility, which was not received well by a lot of people, I'll say.
Yeah, but that's my point, where it's like, it's not that, oh, she has strong opinions on things. She has strong opinions for like 5 seconds on things. And then when she leaves that room and does something else, she might fully believe everything she says. But her opinions also don't really have a good through line. So imagine having to work for her and not knowing which Danielle Smith you're talking to, or where she's going to go on an issue, because there's no ideological sort of pathway you can sort of trace between all the positions she takes. It's very all over the place.
Yeah, I'm curious. I got one more question I want to get your take on. What do you make of her saying that she will not run in a by-election?
In a by-election?
So she's come out and said that she will not run in a by-election. She'll run in the general. She was asked if she would run in
elbow.
Okay, well that's really weird. I made it sound like I didn't know what a by-election was there, but I was just saying, I was just exclaiming that because I was like, clearly you would run in a by-election so you could be premier before the actual general election and be able to have a record. Because like, who's going to be premier while she's not premier, but she's just the leader? Like, was it Casey Maddu's going to step up? Pat Ray's going to step up and be the premier?
Well, Pat Ray spends a lot of time out of town himself, apparently, so...
Pat Ray and Casey Maddu are like the poster children for recall legislation reform. And I don't think you exactly want those people running your campaign, especially considering the fact that Casey Maddu has, like, I would say 0% shot of being reelected based on everything he's done in office and the NDP's strength around Edmonton. So it's not a good look. And I think a lot of Albertans would take umbrage with the fact that their premier is not the premier. It's some leader who's just making phone calls to the interim premier.
Okay, I just wanted to get your take on that.
Well, yeah, I take issue with that a little bit, so fair enough for asking me.
Is there anything else that you want people to hear? Are there any other concerns that you have with Smith or the leadership race in general that you want people to know about? And again, I don't want to present conservatism as some sort of monolith, because I think that when we present any group as a monolithic group where everybody thinks the same and does the same thing, I think we're doing a disservice. But based on conversations you've had with other conservatives, all of that kind of stuff, is there anything else you want people to hear?
Well, what I would challenge people to do who are still in favor of Danielle Smith is that if any of the stuff I've ever brought up about Danielle Smith, saying that Hillary Clinton would be a terrific president, or talking about the WEF in a favorable manner, or flip-flopping on social policies, or flip-flopping on the Sovereignty Act, if it was Travis Taves, if it was Brian Jean, if it was Todd Lowen, if it was Rebecca Schultz, or any other candidate doing it, would you have a problem with it? Because what I feel like today is that people, when they become conservatives, or when people even, this applies both people on the right or left, when people like get a hold of an ideology that they identify with, they end up just associating that with a singular person. They get their backs up against the wall when anyone criticizes them, and believes that somehow they start associating the person more with their beliefs than the actual beliefs themselves. And I would want people to sort of recognize the fact that it's very easy to become tribalistic about politics, and it's actually very, not only I'd say socially unhealthy for people to do that, but I think it's actually politically disastrous to do that sort of thing. I think that people are going to end up being duped by Danielle Smith if she becomes premier. She's going to alienate her own base, and I think that she's also a very easy target for the NDP to market against. So I would just sort of leave people with that, I guess, that you have to be very, very clear with yourself, is that when you take any of the issues that have been raised about Danielle Smith as issues with other candidates, or would you just keep using the excuse that was 5 years ago, that was 10 years ago, that was 5 months ago, kind of a thing?
Okay. I lied. I got one more question. I do that all the time where I say last question and then I say la la la. So one more question before I let you go. One of the things that we've seen already is multiple UCP MLAs coming out and saying, well, two things, really. One of them is, I absolutely will not vote for the Sovereignty Act. It is unconstitutional. It is a train wreck. There have also been reports of some UCP MLAs who have said, if Danielle Smith gets elected, I'll sit as an independent before I'm a part of her burning the province down. Do you think that there should be any part of the conversation surrounding Smith and her leadership that includes the very real possibility that she could very well split the UCP back down against or into the sort of the PC and the Wild Rose lines?
I'm not sure if that would exactly happen. I think that if she became leader, if she doesn't run in a by-election and become premier, I think you'd be more likely to see MLAs say, we're going to vote or have a leadership review right away and move to kick her out if she's not even willing to be the premier when she's supposed to be the premier. I think that's more of a thing. Like, and even then, I would actually say, I don't think Danielle Smith, if she became the premier, would burn down the province or do anything like that, or she'd be damaging. I think she'd even do some good things. The problem is that the Sovereignty Act is like a kind of like bill of fake goods. It's not real. It cannot be done. So even if she does a couple of good things, she's immediately going to get swatted out of the way by Rachel Notley, because Danielle Smith has this massive promise she can't fulfill to her own base, who are naturally going to be mad at her for it. And then she's also kept saying silly things throughout the entire leadership race, and to a certain extent, a lot of her career, that is so easy to run attack ads on. That she's the worst of both worlds. She's overpromised and she's going to underdeliver, except the NDP can run on her overpromising those things, even though she would at some point have to admit she can't even do them. What I think is probably going to, and the funny thing with the Sovereignty Act too, is because at some point in the past couple of weeks here, Danielle Smith has said, well, I'm going to let caucus decide what the Sovereignty Act is going to look like. And this is when I say that the Sovereignty Act in her campaign doesn't even exist anymore. Because how can you say that, oh, I'm going to pass the Sovereignty Act, but caucus who hates it and doesn't want to pass it is going to shape what it's going to look like? She's essentially admitted that it's not going to happen already. And I think that she, as soon as that happens, either she's going to throw a tantrum and fight with the party, or she's going to tell her members, well, it didn't go through. We fought hard on that one. I guess we had to move on. In which, at that point, everyone's going to be extremely mad at her. The funny thing is that people are saying, well, Brian Jean or Travis Taves or Todd Lowen or whoever wins, all the Smith people are going to be upset. I'm like, the Smith people are going to be upset, who are like the hardcores. They're going to be upset even if they get Smith, because Smith is not who she says she is. That's the issue. Is that they have been overpromised something, and they're not wrong for wanting what they were promised, But if she can't deliver what they were promised, there's no way of her satisfying that base. So they're automatically going to be upset before the 2023 election and either stay home or, vote for Artur Pawlowski or maybe begrudgingly still vote for the UCP. But it puts a big question mark on all those voters.
Okay. Again, I want to highlight there's no shortage of things I think that we disagree on, but the fact that A, we're able to have this conversation, and B, we're on the same page by and large in regards to Danielle Smith is problematic. I think that highlights just how potentially problematic Danielle Smith is. I think it also, and I know I said this at the beginning, but the whole polarization and the refusal to engage in conversation, like it's fascinating to me to see people who identify as progressives refusing to have these types of conversations with people who identify as conservatives, when if you did, you'd find out there's some things that you can agree on. I mean, there's things that Lord knows my wife and I disagree on, but that doesn't mean that we stop spending time together. And I think that the more that we can have these conversations where we can identify the common ground, because at the end of the day, here's what I see. It's, despite all of the disagreements, there are fundamental principles that are shared. I believe that Danielle Smith should be transparent with people. I believe that she should hold herself accountable. And I believe that she should let people know who she really is. Sounds like you're on the same page as I am on that one.
And the thing is, at the end of the day, it doesn't really, people just have to act like adults. I don't find it particularly useful that you're pushing to beat the other side when you're not showing that you have the ability to act like an adult. Because at the end of the day, I think society gets worse the more people just start acting with them out of emotion and whatnot, and just can't calm down and just live like a normal person for a second. People are so wrapped up on what team you are on at all times, and I'm very, very conservative. But at the same time, if I can talk to people I know are Marxist, and I can just chat, because you know what, most of the time, not everything is deathly serious, and I'll even debate them lightly here and there. But at the end of the day, just be an adult and stop trying to get one over on someone. Everyone acts like there's a scoreboard following them around in life, and they got to rack up their points. It's not how it works. Just be a mensch at the end of the day.
Fair enough. Wyatt, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I would ask if you get any other responses from Team Smith in regards to the GoFundMe and where the money went and how much of it went and all of those questions. Would love to hear from you.
Am I going to get a bunch of emails after this goes public? Probably. And you'll probably get to see something from that.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Wyatt.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. It's been great.
As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, we would love it if you swung by our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab and signed up for a small monthly sponsorship of the work that we're trying to do here. It is because of the support that we receive from our Patreon sponsors that we're able to continually up our game, and it is tremendously appreciated. So I want to throw a big thank you out to them, and you can go ahead and visit that website and join and support us as well, because we need all the help we can get. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for listening and being part of these important conversations. And we will see you next time on The Breakdown.